Welcome to Inside American Politics by Scoob. I'm your host, Bradley Teller, and today we're diving deep into one of the most dramatic political transformations in modern American history. How does a small-town Ohio kid with a troubled childhood become the author of a best-selling memoir, then morph into Donald Trump's hand-picked vice president and the second-in-command of the MAGA movement? And why has his journey been paved with controversies that reveal the deepest fault lines in American culture? Buckle up, folks. This is the story of J.D. Vance, a tale of ambition, ideology, and the sometimes ugly reality of political power. We'll explore his meteoric rise, his inflammatory comments about women, his controversial stance on LGBTQ rights, and even a shocking scandal involving animal cruelty. This isn't just about one politician, it's about the America we're becoming. Let's start at the beginning. J.D. Vance didn't emerge from privilege or political dynasties. His story begins in a small Ohio steel town, a place ravaged by economic decline and the opioid crisis that would later define so much of his worldview. Picture this: a fatherless childhood, a mother struggling with addiction, friends and family caught in the same destructive cycles that were eating away at Middle America. Vance took his mother's name after his father disappeared from the picture. He watched his community crumble around him, steel mills closing, dreams dying, hope evaporating like morning mist. But instead of becoming another casualty, Vance found his escape route through the Marines. He served in public affairs, deployed to Iraq, and discovered something that would define his entire political identity: resilience forged in the crucible of working-class struggle. Here's where the story gets interesting. This kid from Appalachia didn't just survive, he thrived. Yale Law School became his next stop, and suddenly Vance found himself in the halls of elite academia. But he wasn't your typical Ivy League student. He was questioning conservative orthodoxies, wrestling with institutional stagnation, and developing a worldview that would later make him irresistible to populist voters. At Yale, two figures shaped his trajectory dramatically. First, Peter Thiel, the billionaire tech mogul who would later become a mentor and political patron. Second, legal scholar Amy Chua, who recognized something special in Vance and encouraged him to mine his own background for broader impact. She essentially told him, "Your pain is your power, your story is your weapon," and what a weapon it became. Hillbilly Elegy wasn't just a memoir, it was a cultural phenomenon that arrived at exactly the right moment. Published in 2016, it gave educated America a window into the world that would soon elect Donald Trump. Vance became the translator between two Americas, the working-class whisperer who could explain the anger and resentment that political elites had missed entirely. But here's the plot twist that nobody saw coming. The man who wrote about the decline of his community would later align himself completely with the very political movement that many argued was exploiting that decline. Vance went from observer to participant, from critic to champion, from outsider to ultimate insider. In less than 2 years as a senator, he secured overwhelming party support to become Trump's vice presidential nominee. Think about that trajectory, from troubled childhood to best-selling author to potential vice president in just over a decade. It's the kind of American success story that reads like fiction, except the real-world implications are enormous. Now let's talk about where Vance's rise hit its first major turbulence: his views on women, work, and what he sees as the proper role of motherhood in American society. This isn't just political disagreement, folks. This is a full-scale cultural battleground where every word becomes ammunition. Vance has consistently argued that women who choose careers over motherhood are, in his words, on a path to misery. Let that sink in for a moment. Not struggling with difficult choices, not navigating complex modern realities, but definitively headed toward misery. According to Vance, declining birth rates and women delaying or foregoing children represent a fundamental cultural crisis, where professional ambition has been wrongly elevated above family life. His argument goes deeper than individual choice. Vance has suggested that people without children have less stake in the future, that leaders without families are less capable of making decisions that serve younger generations. It's part of his broader critique of elite culture, a worldview where success defined by education and professional status has replaced the more traditional markers of family and community involvement. To understand Vance's perspective, you have to see it through his populist lens. He's arguing for the restoration of what he calls traditional family values, pushing back against cultural forces he believes are weakening American households. His defenders frame this as moral leadership, a necessary correction to a society that has lost its way. But the backlash has been fierce and sustained. Critics see his comments as condescending and exclusionary, reinforcing outdated ideas that a woman's worth or civic contribution is fundamentally tied to her motherhood status. Feminist writers and political commentators argue that framing career-driven women as miserable ignores the fulfillment and agency that many women find in their professional lives. Here's what makes this particularly explosive: the double standard. Men who prioritize careers are rarely accused of undermining society or choosing a path to misery. When women make similar choices, suddenly it becomes a moral failing and a threat to social order. This isn't lost on Vance's critics, who see his rhetoric as fundamentally about controlling women's choices rather than promoting family values. The debate reveals a deeper cultural schism. For some Americans, fulfillment comes through nurturing family and building community. For others, it comes through pursuing personal goals, independence, and career achievement. Vance's insistence that one path is morally superior to the other has kept him at the center of one of the most enduring and divisive conversations in contemporary politics. What's particularly striking is Vance's refusal to back down. He frames his arguments not as attacks on women, but as critiques of a system that pressures them to prioritize work over family. He points to falling marriage rates and declining fertility as evidence of cultural malaise, symptoms of a society that leaves both men and women feeling isolated and unfulfilled. If Vance's general comments about women and careers were controversial, what happened in 2021 was a political grenade that's still exploding. During an interview with Tucker Carlson, Vance delivered a line that would define his public image for years. "We're effectively run in this country, via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too." Childless cat ladies. 3 words that instantly became a cultural flashpoint, a meme, and a symbol of everything wrong with political discourse in America. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Social media erupted with angry responses, biting satire, and accusations of sexism that went far beyond typical political criticism. What made this particularly damaging was the specificity of Vance's targets. He was talking about real people in positions of power: Vice President Kamala Harris, who is a stepmother, and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who was about to become a parent through adoption. The implication was clear: these leaders were somehow unqualified to care about America's future because they didn't have biological children. Jennifer Aniston, who has been vocal about the stigma surrounding childless women, called the remarks disgusting. She expressed shock that someone running for national office would speak with such contempt toward women who either choose not to have children or are unable to. The entertainment industry, already largely opposed to Trump-era politics, rallied around the criticism with unusual intensity. But here's where it gets interesting. Vance's defense revealed as much as his original attack. In a 2024 interview with Megyn Kelly, he tried to soften his language, insisting the comments were taken out of context and meant as a joke. "I've got nothing against cats," he quipped, as if the problem was feline prejudice rather than gender-based political attack. His more substantive defense focused on what he called the Democratic Party's anti-family culture. Vance argued he wasn't attacking people who couldn't have children or those who chose not to, but rather criticizing a political movement that he believes devalues traditional family structures. Yet for many critics, this explanation rang hollow. How do you accidentally call political opponents miserable and suggest they want to make the country miserable too? When Trump chose Vance as his running mate in 2024, the childless cat ladies comment resurfaced with renewed vengeance. Old clips circulated on social media platforms, news outlets replayed the interview in campaign context, and Democrats seized on it as proof of Vance's divisive worldview. Some Republicans privately worried it could alienate suburban women, a demographic already skeptical of the party's tone on gender issues. The incident became more than a political gaffe. It became a cultural symbol. It exposed the growing tension between Americans who see family life as central to moral authority and those who believe leadership and empathy aren't limited by parenthood status. In an era where every statement is dissected and replayed endlessly, Vance's words became a lens through which voters interpreted not just his character, but the broader political climate he represents. Vance's comments about women and family took an even darker turn when he began linking abortion policy to race and interstate travel. In what many consider his most racially charged remarks, Vance suggested that a national abortion ban was needed to prevent black women from flying to states like California to seek abortions. Let's be clear about what happened here. Vance took his anti-abortion stance, already controversial in post-Roe America, and explicitly racialized it. He wasn't talking about abortion access generally, or reproductive rights broadly, but specifically about black women's reproductive decisions and their ability to travel across state lines for health care. The reaction from civil rights advocates and reproductive rights groups was immediate and scathing. They accused Vance of using black women's reproductive choices as political talking points, while ignoring the broader issues of health care inequality, poverty, and limited access to contraception that disproportionately affect communities of color. But Vance didn't stop there. In a separate appearance, he dismissed abortion as something most suburban women don't actually worry about, suggesting that media coverage had exaggerated its importance to voters. This comment came just months after polls showed abortion rights were a defining issue in suburban districts nationwide, particularly among women who had shifted away from the Republican Party after the fall of Roe v. Wade. Think about the political calculation here. Vance was essentially telling suburban women, a crucial voting demographic, that their concerns about reproductive rights were manufactured by media hype rather than genuine personal stakes. For many women, this felt like a double dismissal. First, their autonomy was being restricted, and second, their concerns about those restrictions were being invalidated. When confronted with criticism, Vance defended himself by claiming he was discussing media priorities rather than women's actual concerns. He reiterated his belief that the federal government has a moral obligation to protect what he calls unborn life, and that a national abortion ban would bring moral clarity to a divided nation. But his emphasis on specific racial and demographic groups continued drawing scrutiny. Activists argued that his language played into long-standing stereotypes used to police and shame the reproductive choices of black women throughout American history. Instead of addressing systemic barriers that limit access to maternal health care, barriers that disproportionately affect women of color, Vance and his allies chose to criminalize abortion and restrict women's agency. The fallout has been intense and sustained. Reproductive rights advocates accuse Vance of reframing abortion as moral failing rather than complex personal decision. Civil rights leaders warn that his comments reveal willingness to exploit racial divisions for political gain. Even among some conservatives, his rhetoric raised concerns about alienating key voting blocs, particularly suburban and moderate women who might otherwise support Republican economic policies. Perhaps no issue has generated more controversy around Vance than his aggressive stance on transgender rights, particularly his proposed Protect Children's Innocence Act. This legislation sought to make it a felony for medical professionals to provide gender-affirming care to minors, including puberty blockers, hormone treatments, and certain surgical procedures. Vance framed the bill as necessary to protect children from irreversible decisions, arguing that young people are too vulnerable to make life-altering choices about their gender identity. But critics called it a direct attack on transgender youth and their families, warning that it would criminalize doctors and worsen mental health outcomes for some of the country's most at-risk young people. What makes Vance's approach particularly inflammatory is his rhetoric. He hasn't just opposed transgender health care. He's used language that aligns with far-right extremist movements. In speeches and interviews, he's described medical professionals and educators, who support transgender youth as groomers and ideologues. He argues that American institutions have been captured by activists pushing what he calls radical gender ideology. Let's pause here and consider the weight of that word, groomers. This isn't policy disagreement language. This is accusatory terminology that implies sexual predation and child abuse. When applied to doctors, teachers, and counselors who work with transgender youth, it's not just inflammatory, it's potentially dangerous, contributing to a climate where these professionals face threats and harassment. Medical organizations, including the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Medical Association, have repeatedly affirmed that gender-affirming care, when provided under professional guidance, can be life-saving for transgender youth. They warn that banning such care could lead to higher rates of depression and suicide among young people already facing significant mental health challenges. Vance and supporters of his bill dismiss these medical consensus positions, saying that minors should not be experimented on and that decisions about gender transition should wait until adulthood. His opponents argue this framing ignores the lived experiences of transgender children and their families, who often face years of medical and psychological evaluation before beginning any treatment. For many LGBTQ Americans and their allies, Vance's legislative proposals represent not just political disagreement, but personal threat. Advocacy groups like the Human Rights Campaign and the Trevor Project have condemned his remarks, saying they fuel stigma and hatred while contributing to increased violence and discrimination against transgender people. The controversy has become emblematic of broader culture war dynamics over LGBTQ rights in America. Supporters praise Vance for standing against what they see as politicization of childhood, while detractors accuse him of using fear and misinformation to mobilize voters. The language he employs, linking LGBTQ advocacy with moral corruption, has historical echoes of earlier eras of panic and discrimination that many Americans thought were behind us. Just when you think the Vance controversy file couldn't get any more disturbing, we arrive at perhaps the most shocking revelation of all: his connection to a biotechnology company involved in horrific animal testing experiments. This isn't about policy positions or inflammatory rhetoric. This is about alleged cruelty so severe that it sparked outrage even among people who generally support medical research. Investigative journalists uncovered that a company funded through Vance's venture capital firm had allegedly been involved in experiments on monkeys and dogs that resulted in severe mistreatment and suffering. According to leaked documents and whistleblower accounts, the tests included incidents that read like horror stories: a monkey trapped in faulty equipment that caused fatal injuries, dogs subjected to painful chemical burns on their testicles as part of toxicity studies. Photos and internal lab notes described scenes of distress and neglect that went far beyond standard research protocols. The revelations were shocking not just for their brutality, but because of the stark contrast with Vance's public rhetoric about morality, family values, and compassion. Here was a man who spoke frequently about protecting the innocent and defending life, yet his investment firm was connected to companies allegedly torturing animals in laboratory settings. When questioned about the allegations, Vance's response was textbook damage control. He distanced himself from the company's actions, saying he had no direct involvement in day-to-day operations and that venture investors often have limited oversight of laboratory practices. He called the reports sensationalized and accused the media of trying to smear him through guilt by association. But his response did little to quiet the growing backlash. Animal welfare organizations like PETA and the Humane Society condemned the experiments as barbaric and demanded that Vance's firm divest from any company conducting animal testing without strict ethical oversight. Social media campaigns circulated under hashtags like #VanceCruelty and #Justice for the Animals, pressing him to take accountability and release a full accounting of his firm's investments in biomedical research. What made this scandal particularly damaging was the pattern it revealed. Critics argued that Vance's refusal to take a stronger stance showed a moral blind spot, one that valued profit and political image over ethical responsibility. The fact that his firm continued funding the company even after internal complaints were raised only fueled perceptions of negligence and indifference. Bioethicists pointed out that while animal testing remains common in medical research, the level of suffering described in the reports violated federal guidelines under the Animal Welfare Act, which requires humane treatment and oversight in laboratory experiments. This wasn't about necessary medical research. It was about alleged cruelty that crossed clear ethical and legal boundaries. Political opponents seized on the controversy as evidence of hypocrisy in a candidate who often speaks about defending the innocent and protecting life. They argued that his silence in the face of animal cruelty undermined his credibility as a moral voice in American politics. Even after attempts to downplay the story, the phrase "monkeys and dogs" became shorthand in headlines and social media posts, criticizing him as morally inconsistent. We've traced J.D. Vance from a Steeltown childhood to the center of national power, and watched how a personal story turned into political fire. Whether you call him a voice for the forgotten or a master of culture war theater, his rise forces us to confront what America values now. Want to hear the uncut interviews and the moments we didn't air? In the next episode, we'll reveal a conversation that changes how you think about his motives, and it wasn't recorded for TV. Download the Scoob app now to get access to the full story, exclusive bonus material, and the extended interview you won't find anywhere else. I'm your host, Bradley Teller. This has been Inside American Politics by Scoob.